Kevin Rudahinduka, open banking starts in Europe. How does it affect banks in Africa as it unfolds in Europe? What do you think, guys?
Good question. The work that we've been doing lately it's amazing how far the ripples of all this one is spreading. From tips of Africa to out into the US and Australia. Everybody is very much kind of looking at what Europe and as you say, Simon, the UK is doing in this space. So I kind of think even if obviously with the regulation from a European perspective, these things are becoming mandatory, but out into Africa it's not. But people are still adhering to the standards. So to your point, I don't think there's the kind of closed-mindedness of until we're forced to do this, we won't. Which actually we've seen probably over the last 10 years in terms of exposing this type of data and APIs generally to people through kind of fear of loss of control. So actually everybody's really getting on board. I think people are seeing that through organizations getting ahead of it with big incumbent banks like BBVA doing it and like their world's not ending. Then actually we're in a situation where people are getting in the game.
I think that was really surprising when we were in Africa or in the US before Christmas. Areas that are just not affected by any of that legislation. There are lots of people looking at this and saying, well, how quickly do you think it will come over here and how quickly can we take advantage of it? And I think that comes back to API business models and players are being driven by competition and regulation. So in the regulated areas, we're having the within Europe the legal push to make APIs available, but ultimately then that opens the door to the competition play, which is actually what APIs are we going to make available? Are we going to go above and beyond what's there? The regulation isn't even in our geography, but maybe we can argue with our local regulator that because they're doing it in Europe, it might fit over here. So I think that those two drivers, we're seeing the baseline being put in by regulation, but beyond that, competition can start taking over, and especially tier 2, tier 3 banks and players are starting to say, wow, we could suddenly have a walled garden and have the whole startup army helping our bank become a tier 1 player, whereas we don't have that ground to protect.
Well, there's definitely evidence of that, isn't it? That's come up in a lot of conversations really about almost challenging the suppliers to banks with being able to use 2-3 man startups who are really, really capable in this stuff. So it's a really interesting sort of dynamic. I don't know if you've got opinion. Have you been asked to Africa to go and talk about open banking?
I've actually never been to Africa except Morocco.
So if you've got a need, Simon Vans-Colina,
Someone's busy.
I think the eye-opening thing for me is that regulation can not just be about walls; it can be about bridges into new markets and new opportunities as well.
Good soundbite.
Nice. Great. I think it's. Some things just wouldn't happen unless everybody moves at the same time and everybody opens up the same amount at the same time. And once that happens, it just creates a new market, And I think this is one of those great examples where the CMA has done a fantastic job of just seeing where the world was going and just saying let's just make the best version of it. And I'm really excited about that.
But where do you stand on sort of standards versus evolving APIs? Because that always seems to come up. On one hand, email, FTP, HTTP, they were the standards on which the internet was built. But then we had that whole period where browsers were introducing a whole variety of new things. And then ultimately the organization would see what worked and then get back together in order to then codify that. Do you see a similar thing for financial services, or is it a different territory?
Well, the browser standards, the HTTP standards, and the RFCs evolved over a much longer period than the open banking implementation entities had. Imagine they have to take 9 of the biggest banks and the biggest regulated institutions in the world and get them to agree on something and implement it with incredibly aggressive timelines. And I think. When you actually see what they've done, even though the big story last week was that a few of the banks are a bit late, but in the room today everyone was like, we missed a deadline by a week or two. Some of the banks are a little bit further behind, but all of them have done something and they're all going to launch this one API. And I think it'll be one of those things where as soon as the API is out, it'll be super obvious about how it can be better. And we've kickstarted this process of rapid iteration now. I think the API will evolve. Version 2 has already been discussed, and in the room they're talking about things that aren't in scope for version 2, but are definitely in scope for version 3, and it's just going to get better and better now. And I think that's just broadly really positive.
And that's actually fundamentally different to any regulation that's come before it, right? If you know the difference between the releases of PSD and PSD2, people waited until it was mandated to make those changes. So if now actually what we're seeing is people picking up the mantle and moving that stuff, you know, it feels like there's a community around that moving it forward. That's fundamentally different to how regulation's been implemented in the past.
Of course, the open banking implementation entity is not going to end. It's not going to shut down at the end of its mandate. It's going to be part of the new whatever payment scheme organisation, and its work will continue. So, like the future is API driven.
So, is there a press release, a kind of mandated company, not company line, a line around the people doing APIs? Because I think what's interested me is we came to Saturday or we came to the weekend and it's like, okay, it's all live. It's it's January. It's now is where it should happen. And then there was actually just quite a lot of silence.
Quite a lot of press releases.
And then there were press releases, and then it was like, oh, some of the banks are going to miss it. And all this, I'm not sure I saw a clear message as to where this was and when people would see the first, I guess, startups or AISPs, PISPs in the market.
So Monzo, for clarity, has launched an API to coincide with the open banking release, which was on Saturday. We blogged about that on Friday. We're not implementing the open banking API specification. We're not part of the 9 big banks, and the specification's evolving very quickly. So we wanted to do something with open banking. We didn't want to be left behind, and we have the opportunity to move really quickly. So we've released an interim API.
Sure.
And we blogged about it on Friday, and as of now, there's 8 to 10 firms which have got in touch. 6 of them are into the process of onboarding, and one of them has already put out a press release, which is Emma, the financial app. They're already talking about their public integration. I expect there'll be a few more press releases, but I don't want to steal their thunder by pre-announcing who they're going to be.
What about the big banking side, I guess? Because when should we expect, and I know you don't represent the organisation or anything to do that, but is there anything that kind of has come out about when we should expect the first consumer implementations of open banking stuff?
I'm not sure what you mean. Do you mean big banks connecting into each other?
When will someone be using the new open banking API interfaces?
Monday or Tuesday next week.
Right.
Honestly, from what I've heard, there's I've heard rumours. The AISPs that I've spoken to have told me about the implementations and how they're going with the other banks, and broadly they're getting on with it. It's happening.
Okay.
Yeah. So I think really it's going to be soon.
Awesome. Right, moving on to question 3.